The snow was falling in heavy sheets that Christmas Eve, the kind that swallowed sound and blurred the world into white, yet the only noise I could hear was the sharp slam of the mahogany door closing behind me. I stood there in the icy wind, my breath a cloud of panic, staring at the door that had just locked me out of my own parents' house. Behind it, I could still hear laughter, clinking glasses, the chorus of Christmas carols sung around a piano I had once practiced on as a child. My father's voice had been final, his tone like iron Allison, "This isn't your home anymore." My mother's cold eyes had slid past me like I was invisible, like I had never belonged at all. And then came the last image seared into my mind before the door shut the smug curve of my brother Stephen's lips as he leaned against the banister, raising his glass to the room. "Merry Christmas, Allison," he sneered, and the laughter that followed was louder than the wind screaming through the fir trees outside. The chill of Seattle's winter wrapped around me with merciless precision, the thin wool of my coat no match for the snow that whipped against my face. My heels sank into the ice, useless, as though the earth itself was conspiring to pin me in place to force me to witness the truth. I was no longer welcome inside the home I had once saved, the home I had once bled for. My fingers curled tight around the small gift box I had made with my own hands, a carved wooden ornament I had shaped in memory of our grandfather. It was supposed to be my peace offering, my way of showing that despite years of neglect and whispered insults, I still wanted to belong. Now it lay cracked on the front steps, crushed beneath Stephen's shoe when he shoved me out. I stared through the frost-coated window panes, my eyes searching for one face that might turn, that might show even a flicker of regret. Instead, I saw my mother brushing imaginary crumbs from the silk tablecloth, my father refilling Stephen's glass with pride glinting in his eyes, and cousins I barely recognized raising their phones to capture the perfect family portrait. My face, my presence had already been erased from the frame. In that instant, the bitter sting of betrayal burned hotter than the cold. It wasn't just the snowstorm outside, it was the blizzard inside my chest tearing through every fragile hope I had carried with me that night. I thought of the nights I had rushed home from freelance jobs to cook meals, while my mother was sick of the years I had stayed behind to handle bills, when my father's investments faltered, of the countless moments when Stephen was absent, but still painted as the golden sun. Every sacrifice I had made had been invisible, dismissed, rewritten until I began to doubt whether they had happened at all. And now, as the door locked with a finality that echoed like a verdict, I realized they wanted me to doubt myself into nothingness. The wind lashed harder, scattering pine needles across the porch. My cheeks stung tears, freezing before they could fall. For a moment, I thought of pounding on the door, of begging just to sit by the fire one last time. But then Stephen's laughter drifted through the walls, rich and cruel, and my hand dropped to my side. I would not give them that pleasure. They had cast me out as though I were a stranger, but strangers still had more dignity than what they gave me. I stepped back from the door, the crunch of snow under my boots, the only sound that belonged to me. Behind me, the Lancaster mansion glowed with golden light, chandeliers blazing a monument to everything I was denied. The warmth, the music, the illusion of family, all of it was theirs, not mine. I turned toward the road, the storm swallowing me whole, and in that moment, a clarity colder than the air settled in my chest. I had been erased from my own bloodline, but erasure was not the end. Sometimes erasure was the beginning of truth, and truth would not stay buried forever. When I was a little girl, the Lancaster mansion never felt like a palace, though everyone in Seattle seemed to envy it. To me, it was simply the place where I scrubbed dishes after dinner, while my brother Stephen basked in compliments for achievements he had not even earned. I remember when my mother fell ill with pneumonia during my senior year of high school. Stephen had already left for his Ivy League program, and it was me who stayed behind missing exams and college tours to sit by her bed with bowls of soup and damp towels pressed to her forehead. My father would glance at me sometimes impatient that I had abandoned my own prospects, but he never thanked me. The narrative was always written differently. Stephen, the brilliant son at Harvard, and me, the daughter with no ambition who never quite measured up. It was not just words, it was the photographs. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Family portraits hung in the main hallway. golden frames glinting in the light of crystal chandeliers. In one photo from a Christmas when I was 12, I had been standing in a green velvet dress beside my mother. Years later, that same frame displayed the picture again, only my figure was gone cropped so seamlessly that anyone glancing would believe Stephen was an only child. I tried to protest once, but my mother's voice cut sharp. Allison, you're imagining things. We never had such a picture. My father nodded as if sealing the lie into family history. It was easier to question myself than to challenge the two people who raised me. That was their power, the quiet rewriting of truth, until even my memories felt fragile. When my father's investments faltered during the recession, I was the one who picked up temp jobs, wiring checks to cover utilities holding the line, while Stephen continued his studies abroad. Yet when he returned in tailored suits and expensive shoes, the family praised his brilliance for saving the Lancaster legacy. I listened from the back of the room, invisible, knowing I had carried them through the worst. The story was theirs, and I was a footnote erased or twisted until I almost vanished completely. Still, I kept hoping. Every holiday I returned with a small gift, something crafted with my own hands, a scarf knitted during sleepless nights, a sketch of the house where I grew up, tiny reminders that I still cared. But each year the distance widened, the smiles grew thinner, and the unspoken rule became clearer. Stephen was the heir, the only one who mattered. I was tolerated at the edge of the table, a ghost sitting among flesh and blood. The cruelest part was not their coldness, but the moments of manufactured affection, sudden warmth designed to keep me tethered. My mother would smooth my hair at family gatherings, only to whisper later, "Don't cause a scene, Allison. You know how fragile your father's image is." My father would invite me to join conversations, then silence me with a glance when I spoke too honestly. Stephen perfected the art of subtle ridicule jokes at my expense that earned laughter, leaving me smiling thinly as if in on the humor. It was not outright cruelty, but the steady erosion of identity, the gaslighting that convinced me I was lucky to even be tolerated. Now, standing in the storm outside that mansion, the echoes of those years pressed against my chest. I understood suddenly that I had not been excluded in a single night. The exile had been happening all along, frame by frame, dinner by dinner, smile by smile. Christmas Eve was only the final stroke of a portrait painted without me. The dining room glowed with golden light, the long mahogany table stretched beneath chandeliers like something out of a magazine spread. Silver cutlery clinked against porcelain, and the air carried the buttery aroma of roasted turkey mixed with the sweetness of mulled wine. I had been seated near the far end, a place where my voice would never carry to the head of the table. My chair was slightly lower, the cushion sagging a detail so small but deliberate enough to remind me where I belonged. I tried, as I always did, to insert myself into the rhythm of conversation. When someone mentioned the old piano in the drawing room, I smiled and said softly, "I used to play carols on that piano with grandfather every Christmas Eve." My mother's head snapped toward me, her diamond earrings flashing in the candlelight. "Allison, you're misremembering. Stephen was the one who played. You never had the patience for lessons." The certainty in her voice struck me harder than the denial itself. Around me, relatives nodded, some with vague smiles, as if her words were fact. The memory I carried so vividly, my grandfather's hand guiding mine over ivory keys, was erased with one sentence. I tried again later when my father raised a toast to Stephen for expanding the family's real estate holdings. I actually helped with some of the digital. My father's gaze cut across the table, sharp as broken glass. "Not now, Allison. Don't embarrass yourself." His voice carried, and the weight of it pressed me down into my chair. My cheeks burned while Stephen leaned back, his lips curling. "Let her dream, Dad," he said with mock sympathy. Laughter rippled around the table, not loud, but deep enough to root itself inside my chest. That was the pattern. Every attempt to speak was met with dismissal, every contribution erased or rewritten until silence felt safer. My mother tilted her head and said, "You really must stop imagining these things. It makes people uncomfortable." As if my very presence was an inconvenience, a distortion of their curated narrative. I swallowed hard, my fork shaking as I lifted it, pretending to eat. The humiliation was not in grand gestures, but in the small, cutting details, the way Stephen's fiancée leaned close to whisper something about my outdated dress, the pitying glance from an uncle who turned away quickly, the way the family dog was permitted to sit closer to the hearth than I was to the center of the table. Each act seemed ordinary on the surface, but together they formed a chorus of dismissal that drowned out any claim I had to belonging. When dessert was served, I tried one last time. A cousin asked about the recession years, and I said carefully, "I remember working 3 jobs then to help with bills. It was hard, but I'm glad we made it through." My father's hand hit the table not hard, but enough to still the room. His voice was calm, almost patronizing. "Allison, you were never responsible for that. It was Stephen's strategic thinking that carried us through. Don't confuse yourself with things you couldn't possibly understand." A few guests murmured in agreement. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, the air thinning until it was difficult to breathe. Stephen raised his glass again, his voice dripping with pride. "To the Lancaster legacy, to carrying our family name forward." Crystal clinked all around me, and I lifted my glass too, though my hand trembled. I drank not to join the toast, but to wash down the taste of erasure. The bitter truth that no matter what I remembered, they would rewrite the story until I disappeared completely. Dessert plates had just been cleared when I reached down to retrieve the small velvet box I had carried all evening. My fingers hesitated on the lid palms, damp with nervous heat, despite the cold seeping from the windows. For days, I had worked on the gift carving delicate details into the wood late at night under a single lamp. It was a simple ornament, a sphere carved from cedar with the Lancaster crest etched into its surface, modeled after the one my grandfather once hung on the tree every Christmas. My hope was naive but stubborn that when my family saw it, they might remember me as part of the story, not as a shadow on the margins. I rose slightly, holding the ornament up for my parents. "I wanted you to have this," I said. My voice steady, though my throat tightened. I carved it myself in memory of grandfather. He always said both Stephen and I carried the family spirit. For a brief heartbeat, silence fell. Faces turned toward me, curiosity flickering. Then came the sound I dreaded, my mother's sharp laugh, brittle and bright as shattered glass. "Allison, honestly, a trinket. You think something whittled together in your apartment belongs on our tree?" Her words were loud enough to ripple down the table. My father glanced at the ornament, his lips pressing into a thin line. "We have baccarat crystal ornaments for the tree, Allison. There's no need for sentimental clutter." His hand dismissed me with a flick, as if brushing away dust. The ornament trembled in my grip. I could feel my cheeks heat, not from the fire, but from the weight of dozens of eyes watching. Stephen reached across the table, plucked the ornament from my hand, and rolled it between his fingers. "Nice try," he drawled, smirking. "But next to a Rolex, it looks like something you'd win at a county fair." He let it drop with a deliberate flick, the wood bouncing once before coming to rest on the polished floor. Laughter erupted, hushed at first, then swelling as cousins covered their mouths, uncles chuckled, and even Stephen's fiancée shook her head with a pitying grin. The sound crawled into my ears and nested there, each chuckle another nail pinning me in place. I bent quickly, picking up the ornament, hoping to hide the crack running through the carved crest. My fingers closed around it, shielding it from their gaze, but I couldn't shield myself from the humiliation that burned across my skin. My mother's voice cut again. "Really, Allison, at your age, you should have more pride than to bring something so homemade." She lifted her wine glass, her diamond rings catching the chandelier's light. "Stephen, show them your gift." He did. From a sleek black box came the glint of a Rolex watch, gold and polished, placed carefully on my father's wrist. Applause broke out, cheers rising as if he had bestowed a crown. My father's face glowed with pride, his chest swelling as though the weight of the watch was proof of legacy itself. I sat back down, clutching the cracked ornament in my lap, feeling smaller than the flame flickering in the nearest candle. No one noticed my silence. No one noticed me at all. The laughter continued, glasses clinked, and the evening pressed forward, but inside me something had fractured. It was not just the ornament that had split, it was the last fragile hope that I could still be seen as family. The night should have ended with the carols with coffee poured into porcelain cups and laughter fading into warmth, but for me, it ended on the frozen porch. It began with my father's voice calm, yet edged with steel, summoning me from the table as though I were an unwelcome guest who had overstayed her welcome. "Allison, step outside with me," he said, rising from his chair. The room quieted for a moment, but then the chatter picked back up as though my absence was nothing worth noticing. I followed him into the hall, the scent of pine garlands and candle wax clinging to the air, my footsteps muffled by the Persian rug. We stopped at the front door. My father turned his tall frame, casting a shadow that seemed to grow against the walls. "This house," he said, his tone measured, "was never yours. It belongs to Stephen, to the future of the Lancaster name. You linger here year after year, clinging to traditions that were never meant for you." His eyes were cold, unyielding. "It's time you accept your place." My breath caught, but I forced my voice out. My place I sacrificed for this family when Stephen wasn't here. I carried responsibilities no one else would touch. I belong here as much as he does. The words barely left my mouth before my mother appeared behind him, her silk dress rustling softly. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, her expression one of practiced pity. "Don't embarrass yourself, Allison. We let you sit at our table out of kindness. Don't mistake tolerance for belonging." Her words stung sharper than the winter air seeping through the cracks in the door. Then came Stephen. He sauntered down the hall, the Rolex gleaming on my father's wrist, catching the light as he leaned against the banister. His grin was pure satisfaction. "Still here," he mocked, swirling the last of his wine. "I thought strays knew when to leave." His eyes sparkled with cruel delight. I tried to hold my ground, but my father's hand was already on the doorknob. "Go," he said simply, and the finality in that single syllable was heavier than any sentence a judge could pronounce. I shook my head, disbelief mixing with fury. "You're throwing me out on Christmas Eve in the middle of a storm." My voice cracked, the sound of it echoing back at me in the hollow entryway. Stephen moved closer, close enough for me to smell the tang of wine on his breath. He tugged at the sleeve of my coat, chuckling. "Think of it as a gift. Fresh air might clear your delusions." Then with one swift motion, he pushed me over the threshold. My body stumbled into the cold, the snow crunching beneath my boots as the wind tore at my hair. The door slammed behind me, the metallic click of the lock like the snap of a trap sealing shut. I turned back, pounding once with my fist against the heavy wood, but laughter rose from inside Stephen's, my mother's lighter trill the hum of a carol beginning again. They hadn't just locked me out of the house. They had locked me out of the family. The snowstorm swallowed me, the icy flakes burning against my cheeks like tiny blades. I clutched the cracked ornament still in my pocket, its broken edge pressing into my palm as if to remind me that I was real, that my existence could not be so easily erased. Standing there shivering in the glow of lights that no longer belonged to me, I understood this was not a mistake or a passing cruelty. This was exile, deliberate and absolute. And yet somewhere deep beneath the humiliation and the frost, a different fire began to stir, the fire of resolve, faint but unyielding, whispering that truth had a way of outlasting lies. The storm raged around me as I made my way down the long driveway, boots slipping on the ice breath sharp in my chest. By the time I reached the edge of the property, the mansion was just a glowing silhouette behind a curtain of snow. I pulled my coat tighter, the cracked ornament pressing against my ribs from the inside pocket, and my mind drifted to the only man who had ever made me feel seen in that house, my grandfather, Henry Lancaster. Grandfather had built the Lancaster fortune not with arrogance, but with sweat and a fierce sense of fairness. He believed legacy was not just about wealth, but about responsibility. When I was a child, he used to sit with me in the study, the smell of old books and pipe smoke filling the air, and tell me stories of how he rose from nothing. His voice was warm, patient, unlike my father's. "Allison," he would say, his hand resting on mine, "a name is only as strong as the people who carry it. And you, my dear, are as much a Lancaster as anyone else." One Christmas just before he passed, he took me aside while Stephen was off celebrating with friends. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes held a spark of urgency. He placed an envelope in my hands and whispered, "One day you'll need this. The house, the company, the family estate, it's meant to be shared. Don't let them tell you otherwise." I had been only 19 then, too young to grasp the weight of his words, too desperate for his approval to question him. I tucked the envelope into a box of keepsakes and convinced myself it was only sentiment. Years later, after he was gone, my father announced that the company and the mansion were Stephen's alone. No mention of me, no mention of fairness. I remembered standing in the back of the funeral reception hearing relatives whisper that Stephen had been chosen the heir apparent, while I was just the dutiful granddaughter who fetched coffee and tissues during grandfather's decline. It hurt, but I told myself maybe I had imagined his promise. After all, that was the family's specialty, convincing me my memories were wrong. But tonight, as the snow soaked through my shoes and the bitterness of exile cut deeper than the cold, I felt the truth rise up like a flame. I had not imagined it. I had not invented his words. They were as real as the cracked ornament in my pocket, as solid as the mansion looming behind me. The inheritance had never been meant for Stephen alone. My grandfather had wanted me to have a share to carry the name with dignity, not be erased from it entirely. The thought steadied me as I trudged toward the faint glow of the city in the distance. Somewhere in my small apartment, buried under years of neglect, was the box grandfather had given me. If the envelope was still there, if the documents inside had not been destroyed, then maybe the erasure was not permanent. Maybe I had not lost everything. For the first time that night, a fragile thread of hope wound its way through the storm. By the time I reached my small apartment in downtown Seattle, my coat was soaked through my hair, stiff with ice, and my fingers numb to the bone. The contrast was brutal, from the glittering lights of the Lancaster mansion to the dim glow of my single lamp that flickered weakly against peeling wallpaper. I kicked off my wet boots every step, leaving a trail of slush across the worn carpet, and collapsed onto the narrow sofa. For a moment, exhaustion threatened to drown me, but then, grandfather's voice returned steady and insistent. "One day you'll need this." I rose, pulling an old wooden trunk from beneath my bed. It had traveled with me through every move, every failed attempt to start fresh, yet I had rarely opened it. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the latch, not from cold, but from a mixture of fear and anticipation. The lid creaked open, releasing the faint scent of cedar and dust. Inside were fragments of my past, a faded photograph of me at 10, with grandfather's arm around my shoulder, a pressed flower from my mother that had browned with time, and at the very bottom, the envelope. The paper was yellowed, the edges curled, but my name was written on the front in grandfather's unmistakable script. "To Allison when the time comes." My breath caught. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the contents. There were 2 documents. The first was a handwritten letter, the ink smudged but legible. "My estate, including the Lancaster House and Company, is to be divided equally between my grandchildren, Stephen and Allison. Both carry my name and both carry my heart. Do not let ambition destroy what should be shared." My throat tightened as I read, tears blurring the words. He had seen me. He had chosen me. The second document was more formal, a notarized will dated just months before his passing. It bore the seal of the state and his signature at the bottom, naming both Stephen and me as equal heirs. I ran my fingers over the embossed stamp, the raised lines grounding me in reality. This was not a memory to be dismissed, not a story to be rewritten by my parents' gaslighting. This was truth solid and undeniable. Yet as relief surged through me, so did dread. If this will existed, then what had my parents presented to the courts? How had they managed to erase my name from every mention, every record? The realization sank deep. They had not simply forgotten me. They had orchestrated my erasure carefully and deliberately. And Stephen had been complicit. His smug smile, his words at the dinner table, his hand shoving me into the storm, it had all been built on the confidence that I was powerless to prove otherwise. But I wasn't powerless now. I clutched the documents to my chest, the weight of them both heavy and liberating. They were more than paper. They were a key one that could unlock years of lies. The fire inside me grew stronger than the storm outside. Still a whisper of doubt lingered. Would anyone believe me? Could a single woman with no resources stand against a family fortified by wealth, influence, and reputation? My parents had rewritten history for years. Undoing their narrative would be like tearing down a fortress brick by brick. but grandfather's voice echoed again, faint but firm. Don't let them tell you otherwise. I tucked the envelope back into its folder and placed it carefully on my desk, setting a lamp directly over it, as if to guard it against the shadows. For the first time in years, I felt less like a ghost and more like someone who existed, someone who mattered. I had been erased, but now I had proof. And proof was power. The documents sat on my desk like fragile treasure glowing beneath the lamp's circle of light. I hadn't slept pacing the length of my apartment as the storm battered the city outside. Questions raced through my mind. What had my parents shown the lawyers? How had my name disappeared from every official record? And most of all, how could I possibly fight them alone? A sharp knock jolted me from my thoughts. I froze, clutching the envelope instinctively. It was nearly midnight. Cautiously, I opened the door to find a woman bundled in a thick wool coat, snow dusting her shoulders, her breath clouding in the icy air. She pulled back her hood and recognition flickered. Evelyn Price, my mother's cousin, though she hadn't been invited to a Lancaster gathering in over a decade. Her sharp cheekbones, streaked hair, and weary eyes spoke of a life lived on the outskirts of the family's wealth. "Allison," she said quickly, her voice low. "I shouldn't be here long. Can I come in?" I hesitated, but something in her tone, urgent yet familiar, made me step aside. She entered, stamping snow from her boots, her gaze sweeping the small apartment. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a sadness I recognized instantly. "They locked you out, didn't they?" she asked. The question cut deep. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. Evelyn exhaled slowly, then reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder. "I know what they've done," she said, placing it on the table beside grandfather's envelope. "And I know you have questions." I stayed quiet for years, but tonight I couldn't anymore. She slid a sheet toward me, an email printout between my father and Stephen dated shortly after grandfather's death. My father's words were clear. "We must ensure Allison's name is removed from all filings. Present the amended will immediately. No one must question it." My chest constricted as I read. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't imagination. It was betrayal written in black and white. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she pulled out a second item, a small recorder. She pressed play, and my father's voice filled the room, cool and calculated. "Stephen, you'll inherit everything. Your sister won't contest if she believes she has nothing. Keep her convinced she's irrelevant." Stephen's laugh followed, sharp and certain. "She's been irrelevant her whole life." I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I clutched the recorder, the weight of their cruelty pressing down. Evelyn's eyes softened. "They erased me once too," she said quietly. "When I refused to follow their rules, they wrote me out, pretended I didn't exist. I know what it feels like to vanish in your own family." Her voice steadied. "But you have something I didn't. You have proof, and now you're not alone." Tears blurred my vision, hot against the chill still clinging to my skin. For years I had believed no one would ever stand beside me. Yet here she was, another ghost of the Lancaster family, stepping out of the shadows to hand me the very evidence I needed. I looked at the folder, the emails, the recordings, and then back at the envelope grandfather had left me. Proof. Layers of it. Enough to pierce the lies, to rip apart the story they had crafted so carefully. For the first time in a long time, I felt not just anger, but possibility. Evelyn placed her hand over mine. "They wanted us forgotten, Allison, but they underestimated us. It's time someone reminded them that truth doesn't disappear just because they wish it away." I nodded slowly, resolve, threading through the exhaustion. The storm outside might rage until dawn, but in that small apartment for the first time, I wasn't facing it alone. Isuai! By morning, the storm had quieted, leaving the streets buried under white drifts that glittered beneath a pale winter sun. I hadn't slept, but exhaustion couldn't smother the restless urgency inside me. With grandfather's will, the emails, and the recording from Evelyn, I finally felt as though I had the power to stand against them. For years, I had been dismissed, laughed at, rewritten into nothing, but now I had proof they couldn't twist. Proof was supposed to change everything. Proof was supposed to make them see me. Clutching the envelope and the folder to my chest, I drove back to the Lancaster estate. The mansion rose like a fortress above the snow, its windows glowing in the weak daylight. My mother answered the door, her hair immaculate despite the early hour, her silk robe gleaming. Surprise flickered across her face, but only for an instant before she masked it with that practiced smile. "Allison," she said smoothly as if I were a guest arriving for brunch. "You shouldn't be here." I forced the words out, my breath fogging in the cold air. "I need you to see this." I held out the documents, my hands shaking but steady enough to reveal the seal, the signatures, the undeniable truth. Grandfather left this for me. For us. He wanted everything shared, and Evelyn gave me proof you knew. You and Dad. You erased me. My voice cracked, but I pushed on. "This changes everything." For a moment, I thought I saw her waver. Her eyes flicked down at the papers, her lips parting, as though she might actually acknowledge them. My heart lifted, hope surging so suddenly it hurt. I imagined her softening, imagined her arms pulling me in from the cold, imagined her admitting at last that she had been wrong, that I had always mattered. But then she laughed, a low, practiced laugh that cut through me like glass. "Allison, really? You've let Evelyn poison your mind. That woman has always been bitter." She pushed the folder back toward me with manicured fingers. "These scraps mean nothing. A technicality, a misunderstanding. Stephen deserves the estate, and that is final." I shook my head violently, the cold air searing my lungs. "No, this is legal. This is binding. You can't deny it." Her expression hardened, her voice sharpening. "Don't embarrass yourself further. Do you want the neighbors to hear you ranting on the porch like a lunatic? You were never meant for this family's future, Allison. That was decided long ago. The more you cling, the more pathetic you look." The words hit harder than the snowstorm had. My chest caved, the fragile hope I had carried all night collapsing in on itself. For a heartbeat, I stood frozen, staring at her, praying for even a flicker of compassion in her eyes. But there was nothing. Only cold certainty, only dismissal so sharp it erased every fragile fantasy of reconciliation. I stepped back, my boots crunching in the snow. The documents shook in my grip, suddenly feeling lighter, weaker, as though they were just paper again. My mother closed the door with the same calm finality as the night before. The sound echoed, sealing me out once more. I stood there on the porch, staring at the polished wood, and understood proof was not enough to change them. Proof would never thaw hearts built of ice. The door had shut on me once again, but this time the despair did not drown me. It smoldered. As I trudged back through the snow, clutching the documents to my chest, I knew I could never convince them privately. They would never willingly admit the truth. My mother's cold dismissal was proof of that. If justice was going to come, it would not come in hushed conversations on the Lancaster porch. It would come in the open where lies couldn't hide behind chandeliers and silk robes. That afternoon, I made the call to Michael Grant, the lawyer who had once served my grandfather. His voice was gruff but steady-lined with the weariness of a man who had seen too many families torn apart by greed. When I told him who I was, there was a pause followed by a sigh. "Allison Lancaster. I wondered when you'd finally reach out." He agreed to meet me in his office the next morning. Michael's office smelled of leather and dust, lined with shelves heavy with law books. He studied the will, the letter, the emails, and finally the recording. His brow furrowed deeper with each page. "This is damning," he said at last. "Your grandfather's will is valid. They presented a later document, but this shows fraud. Your father and brother knowingly suppressed the truth." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We can take this to court, Allison, but once we do, there's no going back. They'll fight viciously." I nodded, my throat dry. "I've already lost everything. What else can they take?" It wasn't just Michael I turned to. Naomi Harris, a reporter for the Seattle Times, had once covered a piece about corporate heirs abusing power. I still remembered reading it late at night, the way she had written about injustice with fire that made you believe truth could still win. When I emailed her attaching copies of the documents and recordings, I expected silence. Instead, she responded within hours, "Meet me tonight. This story matters." The cafe where we met was quiet, the windows fogged from the warmth inside. Naomi sat across from me, a notebook open, her pen racing as I spoke. She listened without interruption, her eyes intent, every detail feeding her fire. When I handed her the folder, she flipped through, quickly shaking her head in disbelief. "They erased you. Deliberately. This is bigger than inheritance. It's a family legacy rewritten. People need to see this. Fear and relief tangled inside me. If you publish it, they'll destroy me. She leaned closer, her voice low but firm. They already tried. Now let's see how they handle the light. 3 days later, on December 28th, the headline appeared across the city and spread online within hours. Erased heiress Lancaster family scandal behind the mansion. The article detailed everything: my grandfather's will, the fraudulent filings, the recordings of my father and Stephen conspiring. Photographs of the Lancaster mansion accompanied the story, once a symbol of power, now a monument to betrayal. The backlash was immediate. Reporters camped outside the Lancaster gates. Neighbors, whispered business partners withdrew meetings. On-talk radio callers condemned the arrogance of a family who could discard their own blood for profit. Social media erupted hashtags attaching my name to words like #erased and #justice for Allison. For the first time, the world saw me not as a shadow, but as a person wronged. Inside the mansion, silence replaced the laughter. Calls from lawyers flooded Stephen's phone. Investors demanded answers, and my parents found themselves trapped in the scandal they had tried so hard to avoid. The legacy they worshipped had become a curse. As I scrolled through the article on my cracked phone screen, the image of my grandfather's signature staring back at me, I felt something shift inside. For years, they had convinced me I was nothing. Now the world knew otherwise. The reckoning had come not in whispers, but in headlines. And it was only the beginning. The night the article broke, my phone would not stop vibrating. At first, it was reporters' numbers I didn't recognize, voices demanding comment questions flying so fast I could hardly breathe. I silenced them, turning the phone face down on my kitchen table. For once, I wasn't the one expected to explain or defend. The truth was already out there, undeniable, and it was their turn to answer for it. But then came the calls that mattered, the ones I knew by heart, even without seeing the screen. My father's number appeared first. I let it ring, the sound echoing in my small apartment, cutting through the hum of my old refrigerator. It stopped only to start again and again until I could almost hear his voice in the silence between rings, commanding, demanding, insisting I return to the script he had written for me all my life. Then my mother's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, my hand hovered, the old reflex of obedience tugging at me. I imagined her tone soft and controlled, dripping with the same false affection she had wielded like a blade for years. "Allison, darling, you're overreacting. Let's keep this in the family." I could hear it so clearly in my head that my stomach twisted. I pressed decline, my chest tight, my throat aching. Stephen called next. He didn't stop. 10 times in a row, his name lit up the screen. Each time I saw it, I remembered his laugh as he pushed me into the snow, his voice telling me I was irrelevant. Now, in the face of exposure, he wanted me to pick up. I could picture him pacing the mansion halls, the Rolex flashing as he ran his hand through his hair, the same arrogance now cracking under the weight of consequences. By midnight, the missed calls had piled into double digits, 17 in total. The screen glowed in the dark, a column of desperation. Father, mother, Stephen. Over and over, their voices trying to breach the walls of my tiny apartment through the insistent buzz of technology. Once I might have given in. Once I might have answered, desperate for even a shred of recognition. But not tonight. Tonight, I sat at my desk, the documents still under the lamp, the article open on my laptop. My grandfather's words stared back at me. Both carry my name, and both carry my heart. For years, I had believed I was nothing. Now, the truth shone brighter than the chandeliers in the Lancaster mansion. I wasn't erased. I wasn't irrelevant. The phone rang one last time, the screen lighting up with my mother's number. I stared at it, my reflection faint in the cracked glass. My hand hovered, then fell away. I let it ring until it silenced itself. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was peace, hard-earned and whole. 17 missed calls. 17 chances for them to say the words I had needed all my life. But they had chosen lies too many times. And now it was too late. The storm had long passed, both outside and within me. Days later, Seattle returned to its ordinary gray drizzle, the kind that slicked the sidewalks and painted the sky in endless shades of silver. In the quiet of my small apartment, I moved through each room, slowly touching the worn furniture, the chipped mug on the counter, the stack of books by the window. For the first time in years, these things felt like mine. Not scraps compared to the Lancaster mansion, not symbols of failure, but proof of a life built honestly, piece by piece. The world still buzzed with the scandal. Headlines dissected the Lancaster family's downfall, neighbors whispered about the once untouchable dynasty reduced to ridicule. Reporters camped outside the estate gates, catching glimpses of my father's ashen face, my mother's forced smiles, Stephen's tense silence. Their empire was cracking in public view, and yet for me, the frenzy no longer mattered. I had given them the truth, and the truth had done its work. One afternoon, Michael called. "We can press forward with the legal case," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We have enough to challenge everything they tried to erase. You could claim the inheritance your grandfather intended." I thanked him, promising to think about it. But when I hung up, I found myself staring at the envelope again, the one grandfather had entrusted to me. Inside was more than money, it was validation. Love written in his hand, a reminder that I had always belonged. Did I really need more than that? The phone vibrated again. My parents' number then, Stephen's lighting the screen one after another. I didn't answer. I no longer needed to. Their desperation was not my responsibility. Their regret was not my healing. That evening, I brewed tea in the small kitchen, the kettle whistling softly. I curled up by the window as rain tapped against the glass, a blanket draped over my shoulders. For once, I felt no pressure to prove myself, no crushing weight of expectations I could never meet. The documents lay tucked safely in my drawer, but I no longer stared at them for reassurance. The truth existed unshakable whether they acknowledged it or not. Evelyn visited sometimes. We shared dinners of simple pasta and cheap wine, laughing at memories of being invisible ghosts at family gatherings. She reminded me that survival could be a kind of victory, that choosing peace over revenge did not mean weakness. It meant freedom. One evening, as we cleared dishes, she looked at me with a faint smile. "Do you regret not answering their calls?" I shook my head, the weight lifting from me with the words. "No." For once, silence said everything I needed. Life went on. I picked up freelance projects in IT again, modest contracts that kept me busy. The work didn't make headlines, but it paid my rent, kept the lights glowing warm in the little apartment, and left me with enough to buy groceries and fresh flowers for the table. Each paycheck, though small, felt like triumph earned honest mine. On a quiet Sunday morning, I walked to a nearby park, the air crisp with early spring. Families strolled with children, joggers passed by, dogs barked at the edges of the paths. I sat on a bench sipping coffee from a paper cup and watched the city move. No one knew my name here. No one expected me to shine or to fail. I was just another face in the rhythm of the world, and in that ordinariness I found peace. Sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it comes in the quiet refusal to answer a phone call, in the steady rhythm of a life lived on your own terms. As I walked home, the rain beginning to fall again, I tucked the scarf tighter around my neck and smiled. The Lancasters could keep their chandeliers and their hollow legacy. I had something they could never touch. Peace.